You thought today would be a moment of comfort, a chance for your family to sit together and raise their glasses under the warm glow of golden lights. Yet a single remark shattered that illusion like glass breaking into shards. Laughter still circled the table, but for you, every sound blurred into silence, leaving only the weight pressing against your chest. Behind those familiar smiles, a quiet secret stirred like an undertow ready to pull away every belief you once held. That moment wasn't an ending. It was the opening line of a chapter you never imagined you'd have to write. Your very own family revenge story. You sat there in silence, the world moving around you while your own heart seemed to stop. That single remark echoed again and again, louder than the laughter, sharper than the clinking of glasses. You had known, somewhere deep down, that you were never fully embraced by them, but hearing it spoken so casually turned doubt into certainty. It wasn't just a comment, it was a verdict. The rest of the table carried on as if nothing had happened. Plates passed, stories traded, jokes shared. But for you, every sound was muffled, as though you were listening through water. The smile on your face became a mask, heavy and fragile. Inside, you replayed not just this moment, but years of moments, small and sharp, that had led here. As a child, you believed family was meant to be unshakable, a fortress where the storms of the world could not reach you. Summers at the lake cabin gave you that illusion. You can still remember the smell of pine lingering in the air, the way the wooden floorboards creaked under your running feet, the nights when your grandmother's voice filled the library with stories that made the world feel safe and endless. She would look at you with eyes that carried both warmth and wisdom, repeating the same phrase each time she closed a book. Dignity is the only inheritance worth keeping. At the time, those words sounded old-fashioned, almost ceremonial. But they lodged themselves in your memory, waiting for the day you would finally understand. Things began to change when Nathan was born. You were old enough to notice the shift. At first, you told yourself it was natural, newborns need more care, younger children deserve attention. But as months turned into years, you watched the balance tilt further and further. When you brought home drawings from school, they earned a passing smile. When Nathan scribbled on the same paper, it was framed on the fridge like a masterpiece. You scored well on exams, but Nathan's average grades earned him praise for trying. Birthdays told the story most clearly. Yours were quiet affairs, with a small cake and a few candles. His became events, streamers, decorations, tables crowded with gifts, cameras flashing to capture every smile. You wanted to believe it didn't matter. You told yourself that being the quiet one had its advantages. You wouldn't have to carry the crushing expectations he did. But still, you longed for something simple. Acknowledgement. To be seen not as an afterthought, but as someone who mattered just as much. The cabin was where you found solace. While Nathan basked in attention, you slipped into the library, curling up in corners with books that carried you into other worlds where you weren't invisible. The shelves became your sanctuary, each volume a reminder that stories could outlast neglect, that truth could live in ink, even if it was silenced at the dinner table. When your grandmother passed, that fragile balance in the family seemed to collapse entirely. Her presence had been the anchor, the one force that saw you clearly and insisted on fairness. Without her, the air grew colder. Your mother's words became sharper, her gaze more calculating. Appearances mattered more than affection. Legacy mattered more than loyalty. Your father followed her lead in his own way. He wasn't harsh, but his silence carried its own kind of betrayal. When decisions were made that hurt you, he looked away. When Nathan stumbled, he rushed to defend him. When you stood your ground, his silence felt like a verdict. Still, you endured. You played the role they seemed to expect, the quiet one, the reliable one. You remembered birthdays, even when yours were forgotten. You offered help with chores, with bills, with favors, rarely asking for anything in return. And when Nathan faltered, you picked up the pieces. Yet no matter how much you gave, it was never enough to change your place in their eyes. For decades, you convinced yourself that this was what love meant. That giving without receiving was noble, that being overlooked was simply the price of keeping peace. But deep inside, resentment gnawed. You couldn't ignore the truth. Your sacrifices were invisible, while Nathan's mistakes were excused, even celebrated. By the time of that fateful brunch, you had already endured a lifetime of being unseen. And yet, a small part of you still hoped that one day they might recognize your loyalty, your devotion, your worth. That morning, as you dressed, you prepared yourself for the usual routine. Nathan's stories would fill the air, exaggerated and self-congratulatory. Your mother's approving glances would reinforce them. Your father would nod along in quiet agreement. You braced yourself, telling yourself you were strong enough to endure it once more. But nothing could have prepared you for the bluntness of her words. "You're lucky we even include you." That wasn't a slip. It wasn't a careless remark. It was the crystallization of everything you had lived through, spoken out loud in a way that left no room for doubt. You left that gathering with your chest tight, the silence heavier than anything you could have said. The house around you seemed smaller that evening, the walls pressing in, as if they too had heard your mother's verdict and agreed. Days passed, but the sting didn't fade. You tried to distract yourself, tried to bury the words under routine. But every time you closed your eyes, you saw her expression calm, certain, dismissive. And with each replay, more memories surfaced. The birthdays, the silences, the comparisons. It was as if her words had unlocked a floodgate you had kept sealed for years. Yet what hurt more than memory was what came next. One afternoon, you returned to the cabin, hoping to find peace in the one place that had always been yours. The scent of pine, the stillness of the lake, the familiar weight of books, it was supposed to remind you that not everything had been taken. But when you stepped into the library, you saw something that stopped you cold. Papers lay spread across the desk. Blueprints, sketches, contracts. At first, you thought they were for repairs. Then your eyes caught the words written in bold. Demolition. Renovation. Conversion. You froze. The room that had been your sanctuary, the space your grandmother had filled with love and stories, was marked for destruction. And at the top of the page, stamped like a signature of betrayal, was Nathan's name. Your heart pounded as you flipped through the pages. Each line of ink confirmed what your mind refused to accept. They weren't preserving her legacy, they were erasing it. Erasing her. Erasing you. The next morning, you confronted your mother. You held the documents in your hands, demanding an explanation. She barely glanced at them. Her eyes, sharp as glass, met yours as she said, "That space is wasted. Nathan has plans for it. He knows how to move us forward." Wasted. The word cut through you. Was that what she thought of the summers spent there? Of the nights your grandmother's voice carried you to sleep? Of the lessons etched into every page of those books? Before you could respond, Nathan entered. His grin wide, his confidence unshaken. He glanced at the papers in your hands and laughed. "You love it once it's done. The place will finally serve a purpose." Serve a purpose. The words burned. The implication was clear. To them, your refuge had no value until it was reshaped into his vision. That night, you lay awake staring at the ceiling. The ache inside you was no longer just about a comment at brunch or being sidelined at dinners. It was about losing the last tangible piece of the one person who had truly seen you. The library wasn't just a room. It was proof that you belonged. And now they were trying to take even that. You left the confrontation with your mother, and Nathan carrying more than papers, you carried a realization that cut deeper than any insult. This wasn't only about favoritism. It was about erasure. They weren't just dismissing you at a brunch table. They were attempting to dismantle the last space that proved you belonged. That night, you lay awake, the ceiling above you fading in and out of view. Their words replayed in your mind, wasted close quote, serve a purpose. You whispered to yourself the same phrase your grandmother had repeated for years. Dignity is the only inheritance worth keeping. It wasn't comfort now. It was a vow. In the days that followed, you began to watch more closely. Nathan's confidence seemed unshakable, but cracks revealed themselves if you looked carefully. He answered phone calls in hushed tones, retreating into corners, his smile never quite reaching his eyes afterward. Once, you caught him clutching a letter, his hands trembling before he stuffed it into his jacket. Your parents, meanwhile, clung to his every word. At dinners, they nodded eagerly as he spoke about new projects, close quote, big plans, close quote, and opportunities on the horizon. You said nothing, but you noticed the details he left out. You noticed the receipts he tried to hide, the bills piling up behind closed drawers, the vague promises that never materialized. You stopped trying to argue. You had learned that raising your voice only gave them another reason to call you bitter. Instead, you turned to something stronger than anger. Proof. Every note Nathan left unattended, every receipt he crumpled and discarded, every whisper you overheard on late-night calls, you collected them silently. You weren't hunting for revenge. You were building a ledger of truth, brick by brick. One Sunday evening, you returned to the cabin. You sat in the library, hands on the shelves your grandmother once dusted, breathing in the faint scent of old paper. The blueprints still lay on the desk, Nathan's vision stamped across the margins. You traced the lines of the plan, imagining walls torn down, shelves discarded, your grandmother's presence erased. But then, a new thought rose. What if the same walls they sought to destroy became the very walls that revealed them? What if this library, once your sanctuary, became your evidence? You began writing everything down. Dates of conversations. Names on documents. The time Nathan claimed to be in one place but was, in fact, in another. You created a timeline, not just of his failures, but of their complicity. At the next family dinner, you remained silent as usual. Nathan told another grand story about investors from out of town. Your mother beamed, your father nodded, and you simply listened. But beneath the table, in your notebook, you wrote down every claim, every number, every promise. You knew that lies have short legs. Sooner or later, they trip. Weeks passed, and your ledger grew thick. You didn't show anyone. Not yet. You carried it like a secret weapon, a shield forged in silence. Then came the dinner that would change everything. The table was set with polished silver, the smell of roasted spices filling the air. Nathan arrived late, his shirt wrinkled, his face pale beneath forced smiles. He poured himself a drink before sitting down, avoiding your eyes. Your mother leaned forward, her voice bright with pride. Nathan has been working tirelessly. His next project will put us on the map. You set your fork down, your pulse steady. This was the moment. What project is that exactly? Close quote. The room stilled. Nathan froze, his glass halfway to his lips. Your father shifted uncomfortably. You spoke again, calm but firm. Because from what I've seen, there are no investors. No contracts. Only mounting debts. Am I wrong? Close quote. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Nathan's smile faltered. For the first time, the mask slipped. Your mother's voice sharpened. That's enough. We won't tolerate baseless accusations. But you didn't flinch. You looked at Nathan directly. It's not an accusation, it's fact. I've seen the letters. I've heard the calls. You're not saving this family. You're sinking it. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading across the table. Your father's fork clattered to the plate. Nathan sputtered, fumbling for excuses, but his usual charm dissolved under the weight of your certainty. For the first time, they were forced to look at you. The dinner dissolved into chaos, your mother defending him, Nathan scrambling for words, your father staring down at the table in shame. But you didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to. Your calm presence spoke louder than their storm. That night, your mother cornered you in the hallway. Her face pale, her voice trembling despite its sharpness. Why are you doing this? We're supposed to be a family. You met her gaze evenly. A family doesn't erase one of its own. A family doesn't destroy what should be preserved. You chose Nathan's comfort over truth. I won't let you erase what's left. One evening, as you dusted the shelves, your father entered quietly. He looked older, wearier, his shoulders sagging under the weight of regret. His voice was low, rough. We were wrong. The words landed softly, like a door finally opening. Years of hurt could not be erased in 3 words, but still, you nodded. It was a start. Your mother never said the same. Pride kept her silent, even as the truth unraveled around her. But her silence no longer pierced you. You no longer needed her acknowledgement to define your worth. Nathan, once the favored son, now looked smaller with each passing day. His ventures collapsed, his stories fell apart, his charm evaporated. And with every stumble, you saw the truth more clearly. His downfall wasn't your doing. It was the natural consequence of years of denial. You, on the other hand, stood taller not with arrogance, but with the steady calm of someone who had endured and emerged whole. The brunch had winded you. The demolition plans had enraged you. But the confrontation at dinner transformed you. This wasn't about revenge in the way they feared. This was about reclaiming what was always yours. Your dignity. And as you closed the ledger you had built, heavy with the weight of truth, you knew one thing for certain. They would never again mistake your silence for weakness. The days after that dinner felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, but heavy, as if the house itself carried the echo of words that could not be unsaid. Conversations at the table became shorter, stripped of the usual cheer. Your mother moved quickly through meals, filling silence with shallow remarks, as though forcing normalcy could erase the truth. Nathan no longer swaggered into rooms with stories spilling from his lips. He kept his eyes low, his laughter brittle, his explanations thin. When he spoke, even your parents struggled to meet his gaze. The pedestal he had stood on for years was cracking beneath him, and everyone could see it now. For so long, you had been the one overlooked, the one whose words dissolved in the air. But now, when you spoke, they listened. Not because you shouted, not because you demanded, but because the truth had already taken root. It no longer needed proof, it lived in their silence. Still, you didn't let yourself relax. You knew how denial could resurface, how pride could twist reality. So you stayed steady, recording everything, gathering documents, keeping the library under your protection. This wasn't about destroying Nathan. It was about ensuring that what had been entrusted to you could never again be questioned. One evening, your father came to you again. He lingered at the doorway of the library, his frame silhouetted against the fading light. His voice was soft, almost reluctant. You were right. The words carried more weight than you expected. For decades, his silence had cut deeper than any insult. Now, that same silence broke to admit what you had always known. You didn't answer immediately. You wanted to believe him, but years of being dismissed couldn't vanish with a single sentence. Instead, you nodded, acknowledging the shift without surrendering your resolve. Your mother, however, remained unmoved. She kept her posture rigid, her words sharp. When creditors called, she insisted Nathan was misunderstood. When relatives whispered, she brushed it off as jealousy. Her denial was a shield she refused to lower, even as cracks widened around her. You no longer argued with her. You no longer needed her acknowledgement to validate your worth. But the sting of her refusal lingered. It reminded you that some people choose their illusions over the truth, no matter the cost. Nathan's unraveling accelerated. The calls he once boasted about became confrontations he could not avoid. His so-called ventures collapsed, one after another. The friends who had cheered him on began to distance themselves. Even his charm, the weapon he had wielded so easily, lost its power. You saw it in the way conversations ended quickly when he walked into a room, in the way his laughter died without an echo. And through it all, you stood firm. Not triumphant, not gleeful, simply steady. You repaired the library shelf by shelf, page by page, as though restoring the room restored a part of yourself. Every nail hammered into place was another reminder. You had survived being erased, and now you were building something that could not be taken. Visitors noticed the difference in you. Friends came by, surprised by the calm in your voice, the strength in your presence. They didn't know every detail, but they sensed the shift. You were no longer defined by the shadows others cast, you were defined by the light you created. At one gathering, your mother tried to revive Nathan's image. She spoke of his resilience, close quote, his creativity, close quote, her voice carrying the same pride it always had. But the words floated without weight. Your father avoided her eyes. Nathan kept his gaze fixed on his plate. And slowly, inevitably, the eyes around the table drifted to you. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. The silence between the words and your presence said everything. That was when you realized. Revenge wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about shouting or forcing apologies. It was about becoming undeniable. The cabin became more than a refuge, it became proof. And then, one afternoon, the final confirmation arrived. A letter from the family attorney, neatly folded and stamped with authority. The cabin, the library, was secured in your name. You unfolded the pages slowly, your hands steady. Every line reaffirmed what you had always known. Your grandmother had trusted you, had chosen you, had seen you clearly when others refused. She hadn't left her legacy to the favored son or the proud daughter-in-law. She had left it to the one she knew would protect it. Holding that letter, something inside you eased. Not triumph, not vindication, simply peace. For years, you had carried the weight of invisibility, but here was proof that you had never been invisible to the one who mattered most. You sat in the library that evening, the light slanting through the windows, dust motes dancing like tiny sparks. You ran your hand along the shelves, feeling the grain of the wood, the spine of familiar books. For the first time in years, you didn't feel like you were holding on. You felt like you were standing tall. Nathan, meanwhile, faded further. His ventures gone, his confidence shattered, he became a shadow of the brother they had once adored. Your parents, once so quick to defend him, grew quiet too, each locked in their own reflections of regret. And you discovered a new kind of freedom. You no longer waited for acknowledgement, no longer hoped for validation. You no longer measured your worth against their approval. Instead, you carried your grandmother's words in full. Dignity is the only inheritance worth keeping. The library stood not as a relic of the past, but as a promise for the future. You knew now that your family revenge story wasn't about tearing others down. It was about standing firm in the truth, even when others refused to see it. And as the days grew longer and the cabin settled into its steady rhythm, you felt it clearly. This wasn't just survival. It was transformation. You were no longer the overlooked child. You were the keeper of the legacy. And for the first time, you understood. You didn't need them to include you. You had already carved out your place. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the quiet halls of the house. In the weeks that followed, you noticed how quickly the rhythm of family life shifted. Where once Nathan's voice filled every space with exaggerated tales, now silence stretched across dinners like a second tablecloth. Conversations dwindled into fragments. Even laughter, when it appeared, carried a hollow ring. Nathan no longer moved through rooms with the ease of someone adored. His steps were slower, his eyes shadowed, his words clumsy. The charm that once dazzled relatives had thinned to nothing more than habit, worn and transparent. Friends who once crowded near him slipped away. Calls went unanswered, invitations disappeared. He was left with the weight of promises he couldn't keep and debts he could no longer hide. Your parents saw it too. They didn't admit it, not openly, but the truth showed in the way your father's shoulders sagged, in the way your mother's eyes darted when Nathan stumbled. They had spent years defending him, painting him as the bright star of the family. Now, that illusion dissolved, leaving only the raw outline of a son they had trusted too much. And there was you. For so long, you had walked through those rooms like a shadow, present but unseen. Now, you carried yourself differently. Not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with a steadiness born of endurance. The library had become your anchor, the cabin your sanctuary. Every shelf you repaired, every book you dusted, reminded you that you were no longer invisible. You had claimed your place, not because they granted it, but because you refused to surrender it. Friends who visited noticed the difference. They saw the calm in your voice, the clarity in your gaze. They didn't know every detail of what had happened, but they felt the shift. You no longer carried the weight of someone waiting to be acknowledged. You carried the light of someone who had built their own ground to stand on. One evening, your father came to the cabin. He stood in the doorway of the library, watching as you sorted through shelves. His voice was rough, worn thin by regret. "You've done well," he said quietly. You looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no triumph in your heart, only a soft recognition of how far you had come. "This is what she wanted," you answered, your hand brushing the wood of the shelves your grandmother had once polished. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. The silence between you was heavy, but for the first time, it wasn't cruel. It was honest. Your mother never spoke such words. Pride sealed her lips even as the truth unraveled around her. She tried to maintain order, to insist that appearances still mattered, that Nathan's talent was simply misunderstood. But her voice lacked conviction. You could hear the cracks each time she repeated the same lines. And slowly, her silence became louder than her defenses. Nathan, meanwhile, continued his descent. He tried new ventures, smaller ones, but each failed as quickly as the last. The community that once embraced him now kept its distance. He was no longer the golden son, no longer the center of attention. He became a reminder of promises unkept, of illusions shattered. Through it all, you did not gloat. You did not celebrate his fall. That wasn't what your story was about. Instead, you poured yourself into the life you wanted to create. You protected the cabin, not just as property, but as legacy. You hosted gatherings in the library, inviting friends who appreciated its history, its warmth. You opened its shelves to neighbors, children, anyone who longed for a story. The room that had once been your refuge became a beacon, filled again with voices and laughter not of those who had dismissed you, but of those who respected you. And in those moments, you felt your grandmother's words rise again. Dignity is the only inheritance worth keeping. You understood them now in full. It wasn't about revenge in the way others might define it. It wasn't about tearing down your brother or forcing apologies from your parents. It was about standing firm in who you were, about refusing to let others erase you. It was about turning pain into strength and strength into peace. At the next family dinner, the shift was undeniable. The table looked the same, silver polished, food steaming, but the air felt different. Your mother tried once more to praise Nathan, her words thin and rehearsed. But no one echoed them. Nathan kept his eyes on his plate. Your father stayed silent, his gaze drifting toward you. And then, slowly, the others did too. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. The room itself told the story. The balance had changed. The overlooked child was no longer in the shadows. You realized then that your family revenge story had never truly been about them. It had been about you. About finding the strength to rise when others refused to see you. About choosing dignity when others tried to strip it away. About creating a future not defined by exclusion, but by resilience. As months passed, Nathan faded further from the center of family life. Your mother grew quieter. Your father leaned on you more. And you found peace. Not because they had changed, but because you had. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the lake reflected gold, you sat on the porch of the cabin with a book in your lap. The air was cool, the world still. For the first time, you felt free not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer defined you. You whispered into the fading light, not as a vow, but as truth. I was never raised. I never will be. And with those words, the story that had begun in pain ended in peace. This was the true conclusion of your family revenge story. Not destruction, but dignity. Not bitterness, but freedom. The quiet of the cabin became the final chapter you never expected to write. Where once there had been noise, voices dismissing you, choices erasing you, now there was calm. The shelves stood polished, filled with stories that had survived not just time but betrayal. In the